Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I am Disha Iravi. I'm going to be moderating this session on how there can be no climate justice without human rights and how we need a civic space for a fossil-free future. In this panel, we're going to have some lovely speakers who are going to be highlighting the imperatives of respecting human rights and open civic spaces to achieve human rights as well as climate action. And I would really like to start off with our panelist, Devin Kenny, to start off and set context to why we're here.
Yeah. Is my voice coming through okay here? Okay, cool. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'm glad to be here myself. We've got a lot of interesting panelists with us today. As my co-panelists are going to help highlight, the problem we want to talk about today is how civic space is being eroded by governments and corporate actors in many countries. I'm going to focus my remarks on a key area of interest for Amnesty International, which is the right to peaceful protest. When taking part in a protest, a person is exercising a variety of universally recognized human rights, as well as the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. This includes other rights that are essential to enable peaceful protest, including the right to life, to freedom of association, to privacy, to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention, and to be free from torture and other ill treatment or punishment. Stopping lethal climate change, this most essential issue for the rights of all humans, itself can't be discussed, debated, and solved without the right to express criticism, individually and collectively. Yet protest is being criminalized in countries all over the world, with states passing laws restricting the rights to expression, association, and assembly. In some cases, law enforcement are using their equipment as tools of torture and using technology to surveil protests and instill fear among activists. Research undertaken by Amnesty International and others reveals how criminalization and law enforcement abuse are being used to target climate and other environmental human rights defenders. In many contexts, states are criminalizing human rights defenders who oppose fossil fuels, often resulting in arrest, detention, and mistreatment. And a growing number of fossil fuel companies are seeking to silence defenders through intimidation tactics, including legal action. Marginalized defenders often face heightened risks. Indigenous environmental defenders tend to face disproportionate risks, both because their land is more likely to be a target for fossil fuel extraction operations and because they face unique structural discrimination, leaving them more exposed to violence and abuse. And we're going to hear more directly about the issue of indigenous land defenders from some of our co-panelists, especially I understand Ms. Chai Sarui, who's going to tell us a bit about that situation within Brazil. But I want to emphasize that this is a global issue that affects many, many countries, both global north and global south. And this closure of civic space and crackdown on the right to peaceful assembly is an international phenomenon, regardless in what type of country we're speaking about.
Thank you, Devin. And to highlight a lot of what Devin said, our next speaker is going to be Hamad Shamsi, who's a UAE 94 mass trial victim, and he has lived and experienced the dissent and the repercussions of dissent in the UAE. Hamad is joining us virtually. Can we have Hamad on the screen, please? Okay, over there. And over here. Hamad, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can I go ahead?
Yes, we can hear you. I just wanted to start off with a question. Hamad, you yourself are a victim of the mass trial of 2012 and 2013. How would you describe the impact of that event on the Emirati society, including people you know who were co-defendants?
First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address and to speak about the human rights situation in the United Arab Emirates. And I would like to start by saying I am an Emirati. I was born and raised in the Emirates. And it is actually saddens me that I am unable to participate in an event that takes place in my own country. Because 12 years ago, the UAE government sentenced me in absentia to 15 years in prison. In one of the largest political trial that happened in the UAE history, and it is called the case of UAE 94. In the case of UAE 94, there are total of 94 Emiratis activists, academics, including prominent human rights defenders. For example, Dr. Mohammed al-Rukn, Dr. Mohammed al-Mansouri, and Dr. Sultan bin Qaid al-Qasimi, and many others. They were charged with attempting to overthrow the government because they signed or they advocated for a petition that called for a minor political reform within the UAE. It calls for free election. It calls for greater participation in the political decision-making process within the Emirates. But the UAE government considered that act, that petition, as an attempt to overthrow the government. So they sentenced 60 out of the 94, with a sentence ranging between 7 to 10 years in prison. And unfortunately, they still in prison even though they have completed their sentence. They should have not been in prison for a single day from the beginning, but keeping them in the prison beyond their sentence is a greater violation to human rights. It is a greater violation to the rule of law within the Emirates. And maybe someone would ask, okay, why the government is keeping them beyond their sentence? Because the government would like to send a message to the society and to the activists within the Emirates that if you demand for human rights, if you recall for political reform, if you criticize even the government, you might end up in a prison for indefinite time. And unfortunately, the case of UAE 94 is not an isolated incidence of oppression inside within the Emirates. There are many other cases. Let's consider the case of Ahmed Mansour. Ahmed Mansour is one of the most greatest guy you can ever hear about. Ahmed Mansour was sentenced to 10 years in prison because he tirelessly documented the violation of human rights within the Emirates. He utilized the UN human rights mechanism to address these cases. However, the UAE considered this as an act of a crime, and they sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Ahmed Mansour is not very far from where you are right now. Ahmed Mansour is only 70 to 80 kilometers away, but he cannot participate. If he's not in jail, he will be with you today, speaking to you, addressing you about the situation in the Emirates and asking for a reduction of fossil fuels within the Emirates and all over the world. Unfortunately, Ahmed Mansour is still in prison while you are here. And yeah, this is not only the activist who suffers from punishment from the government, but also the families of the detainees. There are a lot of prisoners, there are a lot of families suffers a lot from a lot of violations, revoking citizenship. For example, the family of Abdel Darwish al-Marzoudi, they revoked the citizenship of Abdel Salam Darwish al-Marzoudi family. Dr. Muhammad Abdul Razak al-Siddiq, Hassan al-Jabbar, families blocked from citizenship. And if they do not revoke the citizenship, why the government is doing this? The government is doing this because it would like to send a message to the activists that not only you who will suffer from our punishment as a government, but also your family. So they are putting extra pressure on the activists to remain silent. And also, I would like to say that the violations that the UAE is subjecting people to is not limited within the country, but also it goes beyond the border. They attack activists out the border. So let me give you the example of Ala al-Siddiq. Ala al-Siddiq, she's Emirati human rights defender. Sadly, she passed away 3 years ago in London, and he could not operate. He could not practice human rights work within the Emirates. So he started, her work like in UK. And the UAE government, before she died, the UAE government planted a spyware in her phone. And also they launched a lot of smear campaigns against Allah. And not only Allah, like myself in 2021, only 5 months after we established Marat Emirates Defense Advocacy Center, and we established it outside, and the UAE government placed me on their national terrorist list. And this move was criticized also by the UN rapporteurs of human rights, Mary Lawler. Yeah, maybe someone would ask, why we are sharing this? Should have not been in jail from the beginning. They should not have, and they have completed their sentence. So they have the right to go back home. Release. If we did not advocate for the release, other activists will go in detention in the future. The second thing I would like to mention that climate justice work is a continuous work. It is not only limited during COP28. It is not only limited during within the blue zone. No, this is a continuous work. And there should be people on the ground after COP is finished to call upon the government to stop fossil fuels expansions, because these governments normally prioritize their interest. So their interest is in the top of the agenda. Their interest in the top of their agenda, and if their interest with the fossil fuel, they will go to with fossil fuel expansion, and their interest with arresting people, they will arrest people. If their interest goes with war, going to war, they will go to war, because they prioritize their interest. And there is no resistance, no dissent within the UAE, no opposition inside the UAE who can stop this government from, following its interest. And I would like to conclude by what always people say: no climate justice without human rights. And yeah, I will be answering the questions that you have.
Thank you, Hamad. Thank you for sharing that, and we applaud your courage and the work you've done. I just want to ask you one quick question before we move on. You spoke about how inclusivity is it's not inclusive of your work and people like you. But one of the buzzwords put forth by UAE and the COP president was that COP has been inclusive. What do you feel about that? Do you feel that UAE and COP, this COP especially, are acting in a way that's inclusive of the Emirati society?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Thank you very much. And I need to highlight there is no civil society inside the UAE. There is zero civil society in the UAE. So whatever you see in the media and whatever you see in the, any statements that you hear from the UAE, it is actually from the government of UAE. So the civil society within the UAE operate under the full supervision of the UAE government. It is either direct supervision or indirect supervision, because there is no freedom of expression. There is no free right to protest. So people cannot express their opinion if it is contradict with the opinion of the government. And also the COP presidency, and this is, they said it before. They said that they will grant people who will come to COP the right to protest and the freedom of expression. What does it mean? That means that will be only limited within the blue zone, and only limited on a certain period of time. So the people of UAE will not enjoy this. So the people of UAE is not inclusive on the whatever COP presidency has said, unfortunately.
Thank you, Hamad. Thank you. Devin, to come back to you as a UAE researcher at Amnesty International, how does the right to peacefully protest in a host country relate to what civil society does at COP to push for effective climate action?
includes protest at COP and at similar multilateral forums, but this COP is being held, as others have, by a government that does not respect that right. In terms of how the Emirati government does not respect the right to protest or other human rights of its citizens, I don't feel that I can improve on what Hamid just said. He said everything that I would have wished to have said, and I second him on every single point. And yeah, this is not a this is not a place where civil society exists, and that's been a huge problem. And even organizing this within the blue zone has been difficult. And yeah, I'm just grateful that we were able to listen to Hamid's remarks live with a minimum of mysterious technical disruptions. So yeah, just thanks a lot, Hamid, for being present and for laying this all out so clearly.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Hamid, again. Katrina, I wanted to come to you. As a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, the COP28 presidency has been telling the world that they are committed to an ambitious outcome on fossil fuels. What makes you doubt that this will happen?
Thank you. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you for coming here, and thank you to my fellow panelists, and in particular, of course, Hamid, for joining us here today. I think this is a really important moment at COP28 to have Hamid join us for this discussion. I think, yeah, there's no better way to express what Hamid just told us about really what the zero tolerance policy for dissent means for human rights defenders like him, for those who live in exile, but also, of course, for those who are behind bars. And as has also been mentioned, protests are effectively prohibited, and those who criticize the government risk being detained. And this is important. This is a question that's been raised here, including at COP28 and at the lead up, that this is also, these are kind of laws and provisions that are in place and potentially also impact people attending COP28 and, for example, wanting to protest outside of the blue zone. So I want to illustrate a little bit more what this situation means for climate activism, and more specifically for achieving a really, really ambitious but also crucial goal, such as the goal of phasing out fossil fuels, which is, as you all know, one that is being discussed as we sit here for the outcome of this COP. At Human Rights Watch, we published a report 2 days ago documenting the impact of air pollution fed by fossil airments and use of fossil fuels are one of the factors causing this problem. The health effects of air pollution are severe, and the World Health Organization, for a good reason, identified air pollution as this during the Q&A or afterwards about the findings in our report, but just to give you a sense, in the UAE, the levels of PM2.5, so fine particulate matter that's particularly harmful because it penetrates deeply in the lungs, is yearly, the yearly average is 8 times higher than what the World Health Organization considers safe for human health. So as we were doing this research, you have to know that international human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, have no access to the country to undertake independent research. So we were not able to actually come here to do the research. This is the first time I personally set foot in the country, but that's also true for many of my colleagues who are focusing their research on this country and have not been able to access the countries for many years. Human Rights Watch, therefore, for this research, contacted environmental groups and individuals, also academics, some based inside the UAE, some based elsewhere. And we wanted to ask them about their views on the issue of air pollution, the role that fossil fuels play, and specifically also government policies related to air pollution, and if these are sufficient. Importantly, we also interviewed migrant workers who make up more than 20% of the population here in the UAE, and who are among those most exposed to air pollution, as well as, of course, also heat. That is kind of a factor. Environmental groups, activists, individuals, we reached out to, also academics. The reason I'm telling you about this experience of clear that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, in the UAE to freely scrutinize and openly speak about the weaknesses of its air pollution policies as they relate to fossil fuels, and more generally about environmental policies and what needs to happen to improve those. So why does this matter for COP28? Many climate activists traveling to COP and who are here now are seriously concerned about their own safety in the host country that has jailed people based on their social media posts, based on their interactions, and makes protests effectively illegal. And there's nobody here at the conference who can scrutinize the climate record of the UAE effectively or publicly protest, including during this COP outside of the blue zone, at a time when, as you all know, the country is trying to portray itself as a climate leader. So this is, of course, particularly problematic urgently. And that includes a commitment to phase out fossil fuels. So I think in the lead up to this COP, unfortunately, also state parties to the UNFCCC have at this point, we're here at COP, but I think the least, the UN and also governments attending these negotiations urge the UAE presidency to uphold the human rights commitments towards COP participants during COP, to allow for strong pressure on fossil fuel phase out, but also to continue that commitment after COP on to release human rights defenders behind bars, including Ahmed Mansour and many of the others that were mentioned here earlier today.
Thank you, Katrina. And like you said, even though we are allowed to protest within the blue zone in the UNFCCC space, there are a lot of rules that keep it repressive. Like we're not allowed to name countries or states or companies. So, Katrina, what do you think the UNFCCC parties and the Secretariat should do to ensure that civil society and indigenous peoples are able to make their voices heard in the future COPs?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and also one of the reasons we're speaking about this here today is, of course, because this is an issue that won't go away. Once COP28 is over, we will still need to address this issue, because we've all witnessed previous where public participation was not meaningful and where space to protest, for example, was extremely limited. And that's not just referencing, of course, last year, but previous COPs where civil society and indigenous peoples had a very, very difficult time meaningfully participating. So this is an issue that's exemplified by the situation here, but it's a much broader issue, and one also that's known. And I think it's really the right time to reflect on this very thoroughly, especially when we're thinking about the commitment that was also referenced earlier around inclusiveness and transparency in this process at the UNFCCC. So I think for future climate COPs, the UNFCCC and parties need to really think thoroughly about what this means in practice and to not close their eyes when it comes to difficult questions. I want to highlight two things in particular. I think one thing that has been a discussion for many years is transparency around the host country agreement and what it says, and specifically what it says about human rights and what it says about the fact that the host of an international climate negotiations needs to commit to upholding human rights in the lead up, during the climate conference, and after. So that is something that I think is a key issue, and making this host agreement public, which is something that, as far as I'm aware, hasn't happened for this COP or previous ones, but there's a commitment, including from the negotiations in Bonn this year. There's a commitment to make it public, and I think doing so, of course, ahead of the climate negotiations could go a long way in ensuring that there's accountability. So making those commitments public could help civil society to really raise those concerns early and ensure accountability. And the second point I wanted to just briefly make is that I think there needs to be some form of criteria really that governments need to agree on. What are the criteria for hosting COP? How can we ensure what types of criteria in terms of human rights standards need to be met? And that is, of course, in the context of the UNFCCC, something that's been discussed before, again, as I said, but I think there needs to be also really a strong push on this, both from parties and from the Secretariat, the Executive Secretariat, to support that.
Thank you, Katrina. Next, I'd like to come to you, Michelle. Michelle is the Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders. Would you be able to introduce yourself and also tell us what are the legal obligations of states under the UN Aarhus Convention related to ensuring the respect and protection of the rights of environmental human rights defenders, and what mechanisms exist to ensure that they respect these obligations?
Thank you for the invitation. I will start with a brief reminder of what the Aarhus Convention is, just to give some context to those who may not be familiar with the convention. That's a legally binding convention that has been adopted in 1998 and based on three pillars, the three pillars of the Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, that is access to information, public participation, and access to justice. And that's an international instrument. It's not a regional instrument. It's open for accession to any UN member states. Currently, we have only 47 state parties, including the EU, and one African country, Guinea-Bissau, who has decided recently to join the convention. Now, to reply to the question you raised about the legal obligations from states to the protection of defenders, I would simply turn to Article 3.8 of the convention that states, and I'm quoting, that state party shall ensure that, quoting, persons exercising their rights in conformity with the provision of this convention shall not be penalized, persecuted, or harassed in any way for their involvement. And persons mean indeed environmental defenders. We have a broad definition. Hence, Article 3.8 of this convention is a legal binding obligation for states to protect defenders from intimidation, from threats, and from harassment. And Article 3.8 would cover penalization, persecution, harassment of defenders by private entities, but also by public officials. Three complementary mechanisms have been established to ensure the respect of this obligation under the Aarhus Convention. The first is what we call the Compliance Committee, established in 2001, which is composed of independent experts that are there to review the compliance by states, by all parties, to the main provision of the convention. But in 2021, because they saw that there was an increasing number of environmental defenders that were threatened, penalized, harassed by state and companies, they decided to establish a new rapid response mechanism under the form of special rapporteur, and have been appointed 1 year ago to this mechanism. That's a rapid response mechanism to deal with all cases of penalization of defenders, and I'm there to protect defenders and to provide inputs also to states on how to establish new methods to protect defenders. Now, briefly to focus on my mandate, I'm using the same working methods and tools as the rapporteurs. That is, letters of allegation, country visits, action. The main difference is that I don't need to receive the consent of the state to travel. Simply, I inform the mission in Geneva that I'm traveling to a country, and then in the country, meeting with the government and doing my own investigation without seeking the consent of the state. That's the beauty of the mandate. Important to understand is the scope of the mandate in terms of the geographical scope, in fact. The mandate is able to intervene, of course, on the territory of the Aarhus Convention, that is the 47 states, including the EU, protection from all states, coming from states, from all public authorities, but also from companies and others. And when it comes to companies, the beauty is that it includes also companies that are not based in one of the countries, like, for instance, a company based in Canada or the US or Australia, would operate in one of the countries which is party to the convention, then defenders being penalized by those companies could seek protection from my mandate. The big case is, for instance, Rio Tinto operating in one country in Europe. Then outside of the territories, like in Africa, Latin America, Asia, when defenders are facing threats from state entities, and we have, for instance, the example of the UK security force in Nigeria, or companies that have headquarters in one of the countries party to the Arras Convention, like a Spanish company doing harm to defenders in Colombia, Peru, Latin America, or a French company, like Total Energy, doing harm to defenders in Uganda, then the mandate is also relevant to intervene because the company has its seat in one of the countries which is party to the Arras Convention. And lastly, that also includes international financial institutions, like for instance the European Investment Bank, that would fund a project in one country, and the project would harm to defenders, then would be able to intervene with the bank to raise awareness on how they are penalizing defenders. Same, and lastly, with the World Bank, because many countries have a seat at the World Bank, and if the World Bank would finance a project that would harm defenders or communities in a country, then the country representative to the World Bank could also be approached by the mandate to seek reparation to the defenders.
Thank you. As a follow-up, I wanted to ask, what are some of the main concerns that have essentially required your interventions with regard to the protection by the European states of the rights of environmental human rights defenders in the context of climate and energy policies? And can you draw any lessons with regard to effective approaches to ensure effective protection?
Yes, thank you. I mean, since I've been appointed, I've been traveling a lot in many countries in Europe, also outside of Europe. I've met with a large number of defenders from those countries. And one matter of concern for me is SLAPs, the increasing of use of SLAPs in Europe, targeted to defenders. And that's why we need in Europe, Hannah, we need a very strong anti-SLAP directive. We must push back possible governments' attempt at watering currently the provision of this directive. Just to know that out of the complaints that I've already received, 3 include allegations of persecution through civil and criminal proceedings, but also SLAPs. That's important to note. The second element in terms of assessment is a crackdown on environmental activists in Europe, and especially those who are using new forms of mobilization, like civil disobedience, of course. They face severe restriction of civic space and freedoms. In public discourses, we see many ministers in Europe calling them terrorists in France, in Germany, in Austria, and this rhetoric from politicians serves as a basis for harsher policies, law enforcement, and judicial responses. Now, policies and laws, like in Germany, some municipalities would forbid of climate change on protest sign. It's forbidden. You cannot put climate change on a poster. In the UK, laws are forbidding certain forms of protest, those who are using mainly by environmental movements. In terms of law enforcement, we see many more harassment of protesters with multiple identity checks, arrest, administrative fines, and on trap on charge, arrest of journalists, including in France, covering protests, police brutality during protests, flashballs, water cannons, pen grips in Germany, other countries, and also abuses in police custody in Denmark, in Portugal. Threat also in terms of judicial measures in Italy and in France. You see that activists are banned from cities for participating in protests. We see extensive investigations and surveillance measures drawing from counter-terrorist laws that are used to put activists under heavy surveillance. Phone, homes, vehicle being tapped, home raids, etc. And we see also extended preventive detention, sorry to mention already again Germany, but up to 30 days in Bavaria. That's awful. And disproportionate court sentences, like 2 years prison in UK for simply blocking a bridge. And finally, regarding effective approach to ensure protection, prevention is for me the key element. And I will conclude by that, saying that the main tool to protect defenders would be to call states that are party to the convention to respect fully the main provision of the convention. Thank you very much.
Talking about repression, I want to come to you, Chai Surui. As an indigenous leader in Brazil, we know that indigenous people have faced restriction on civic spaces. I wanted to understand how it is now, and what is your message to Brazil and the world?
Good afternoon, everyone. Kanatenga in my language. First, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to talk in this table. I think it's a really important moment in this COP. And first, we passed the worst moments to the indigenous peoples in Brazil in the last government, and now we have a new vision about the indigenous peoples, about the environmental in our country, with a new government, with an indigenous minister, Sonia Guajajara. But the truth is that our lives still is in risk. You know, me, my mother that's here, my husband, we already are receiving death threats. Our life is in risk because we are the guardian of the forest, because we are fighting for our territories, because we are saying what the people don't want to listen. You know, an example of that is in this year, we have an indigenous leader from the Arara people that was murdered 2 weeks after to denounce what's going on in his land in United Nations. So we not should have afraid to say what's going on in our lives, what's it's happening in Brazil, you know. I don't know if you know what is this, go to sleep with afraid, not for you, but for your kids, for your family, you know, for your home. And we need, we really need to, that the world are concerned. We need really that the world pressure for the environmental and human rights activists, you know, because if you will not, this is not will change. We will continue be murdered and assassinated for fighting for our future, for the nature, you know. My message to Brazil, to the world, is that we need to stop pretend that we are, because the human lives, you know, because the nature, they will continue here after Earth. But we are only condemn the humans' lives. So if you don't understand this, if you don't understand that we need put the indigenous peoples, the young, the women, the activists that is in the front line of this fight in the decision table, never will change, you know. So we need to do this right now. We don't have more time. The climate change is not more a thing that we are talking about the future. We are suffering and we are feeling this right now in our territories. And across of the world, millions of people are being affected with the climate change. So if you want if you want to save the human rights, we need to understand that these people need be on the table, deciding the things, you know, because we are once the solutions against the climate change. We are 5% of the world population, and we protect 80% all the forests, all the biodiversity. So without us, we don't have future, we don't have nature, because we believe that we are the nature, we are not living here. We need reconnect with our planet. We need to remember this, that we are not only us, but all you are being nature, you know? And so that's it. We're not more, cannot more accept it that our lives in risk because this is still happen in our countries, this is still happen in our territories, you know. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chai, for reminding us all that we are indeed nature. When your presidency changed to President Lula, they also promised that they'd be hosting COP30 in Brazil. I want to know what your demands and what your expectations from COP30 are.
So my expected it's we have a really different COP when we can show this, show what's all the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, not only denunciate what's going on in our place, but to show you that we are put the solutions we are doing these solutions in our territories right now. You know, we are planting, doing the reforestation, we are working with ethnic tourism, we are monitoring our territories, we are fighting for our lives and for the lives of the planet. So what I expect that all the world can see this, not only the problems, but can see how the indigenous peoples are contributing to change this thing. You know, we not can continue thinking that the development is the destruction of the forest. We need change our mindset, you know, and see that other ways is possible. And the indigenous peoples, the more vulnerable and affected people are bringing, doing the solution in our place. We want to show you that we are the nature. You know, we want to show you that the development's not big buildings. We want to show you that all that we have come from the nature. The nature is the life to us, you know. To us, the trees, they are sacred, you know. And we want to bring this. We want to do a more inclusive COP. You know, it's so difficult sometimes to be here. I don't speak English. I'm learning this because I need that you listen me. I need that you listen the voice of the indigenous peoples. And it's the most of majority indigenous peoples in Brazil don't speak this language. We speak our traditional language, and we need you listen and you understand that we want to contribute. We have our knowledge. We understand how to live in harmony with the nature, you know. And this is other ways possible, but you need to want to listen. We need to understand that we need to be together with us. You need to support the indigenous peoples. You need to listen more, you know. So I hope that in Brazil we can advancing more. We can stop to pretend that we want to do, and because we know what we need to do. We know that we need to stop the exploring of the fossil fuel. We know that We need to listen more the indigenous peoples, the black people, the women, the youth. We know this, but we need to go to the action, you know, and we need now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chai, for your words and your leadership, and it was amazing. Thank you. Now, I wanted to come to Mariana Sirne. As I understand, you're the chief of Brazilian Attorney's Office for Climate and Environmental Protection. And even with Lula's presidency, which was hailed as a win for environment and indigenous people, there still seems to be a lot of problems persisting. So as someone who works there, what is the administration of President Lula doing to engage with environmental and human rights groups and to facilitate their meaningful participation in environmental decision making in Brazil? And I also want to check if you wanted to respond to anything that Chai said.
Of course, I must. Okay. Hello. Good afternoon. I'm Mariana Cirne. As you see, it's very difficult, my word, and I'd like to explain a little bit what the public lawyers, that's my position in Brazil, does. And Chai is speaking what the size of the problems that we have to deal in all our days. I'd like to say I'm a public officer, and it was as you, there is no free speech, and it was very difficult stay in the government and work. And because of that, I'd like to start talking as a lawyer. I can do a few stuff, the indigenous people and all the defense of the forest, as you can imagine. But I have the invitation, the new administration of the Lula government, and the transition process, it was amazing because of that. We know we cannot do anything wrong because the emergency was huge. People are dying, everything. You have to rebuilding all the public policies of Brazil, of the environmental, indigenous, and communities policies. You can imagine the use. I can see, I can told you, I stayed for 3 months. I didn't see my children. I said, okay, someday Mama comes back. Now I have some challenge to do. And in the first day, we started with 5 acts to change the indigenous minery in the indigenous places and lands. And this kind of stuff was going on in Brazil. And you can imagine that it was just the beginning. But I know it's a huge challenge. Every week, I go to the indigenous ministry to talk about some effective acts from the government to change all the horrible scenario. And the challenge is huge. Together, we are listening, you are giving them the real protagonism about these stuffs, because we really believe this is the right way to something in this new administration. And I'd like to say one good example for this. Chai, as you say, it's a courage young activist for climate. And she and more 5 young people propose a litigation against Brazil because, as you know, you have an anti-environmental minister, and they do a lot of stuffs. And but the change was subtle because they changed not the percentile, they changed the line. So nobody, not the all people understands what's going on, but you have to grow up 30% of our emissions. It's horrible. And the youth go to justice to change this. Now, we have a new administration, a new public lawyer's position, and because of that, you have to change our position. Now, you have an agreement with them, and Marina Silva, as you know, the Minister of Environment and Change, and the lawyer, the public lawyer, the officer, did agreement with this year just to recognize the importance of this resistance injustice and give some space to participate of the climate plan it will, you know, it's a little bit, but we really are working to change a massive destruction. You know, it's few, but you can count with the public advocacy as a partner, as someone who wants to rebuilding the Brazilian space in this STEM. So thank you very much.
So Mariana, despite the efforts that you mentioned, there are criminal groups that are involved in illegal deforestation, and it continues to threaten, and they continue to threaten and attack people who dare to raise their voice to renounce these activities, including indigenous people like Chai in the Amazon and everywhere else. Previous governments, like Bolsonaro's, have failed to essentially take a decision and a decisive action to prevent the violence and to ensure accountability when it occurs. How will the current Brazilian government address impunity for violence on ground?
Thank you. Another easy question. In the beginning of the government, the Brazilian government, you have a huge challenge named Yanomami, as everyone knows. I was there. Arrives there, it's very difficult. You have to take 2 helicopters, and the area, you have the criminal generalization there, and to go to there, I take like 8 hours flying. If it rains, you cannot go on. When I arrived there, it was a devastating scenario, and it was the first time IBAMA, is the environmental agents of Brazil, was going back. They are incredible public services, and they really believe what it does. And we stayed there for 2 hours, and during this for 2 hours, they destroyed about 5 boats with illegal stuffs and give the food and all the stuffs to the people who was there. It was the beginning of the rebuilding the state part of the Yanomami challenge. But you know, the size of this area. And you have another countries, and then have the crime comes. There is no boundaries about that. It's very difficult to stop, but we're trying. We're working. We did a lot of stuff. So you publish a restricted area to airplanes, and started to stop the passing boats and all the stuffs to stop the crime. It's a beginning, and I can told us every week I go to indigenous ministry because there is a group with 18 ministers to talk what we're gonna do next week to continue our work. And the Supreme Court of Brazil is an ally in our fight. That's the Supreme Court help us with some measures and some he decided to send some money, more applies to help to deal with this. It's just a beginning, but I'm trying to be my part in this difficult challenge. I think that's what I can do. It's not a big deal. It's a beginning. I can't imagine what difficult it's the indigenous suffer. And every time I heard, they tell us what they're going for in the situation there. It's more difficult. They give me more responsibility to help. But now, in the past, you have a horrible government who didn't heard anything, no transparency, no, it's the human rights. Now, I can tell for what they're doing, we are open to start to build a new protagonism of the forest defense and the human rights. And contact with me. I'm here with you. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to quickly check, Chai, if what do you think of these efforts, if you wanted to respond to anything Mariana said?
No, I just would like to say some more thing about what I expect of the COP in Brazil. That is, I expect the government demarcates the indigenous land that they promised to us. I expect that the Brazilian government sync the Escazú agreement, that Escazú is agreement about the protection of the environmental activists. So I expect that we can building more with the Brazilian government, because it's good to have a minister, but we are the movement, indigenous movement. We are the civil society, and we need being more in talking with the government. And yeah, and thank you for your work. I really I'm sure that we will do a beautiful COP with a different with more advance, you know, because we need this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chai. I wanted to come to Nikki Rist next, the Climate and Energy Director for Center for International Environmental Law. After hearing everybody, what do you think are the human rights obligations of states with respect to protecting environmental democracy from corporate capture?
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay from here? I just want to take a moment to thank the co-panelists, really, especially Hamad, but really all of you, and the organizers for these interventions and for this kind of open exchange that we can have when there is respect for human rights and openness between indigenous peoples and their government of the state. I think, you know, carving out this space to listen, as Chai encouraged us, and to name the other elephant in the room, not fossil fuels, but human rights, including the human rights record of this country, as well as others, and the fundamental relationship between human rights and climate justice. And that includes the right to protest and dissent and to speak out on issues of vital importance, including climate change and its core driver, fossil fuels. There can be no justice without human rights, and that's not just a slogan. Human rights violations, whether here in the UAE or in other states party to this process, are not tangential but core to climate action and justice. And just as climate action must adhere to human rights, so must climate discussions adhere to human rights. Protection against undue influence by corporate actors are really imperative to mobilize broad support for a full, fair, fast, and funded fossil. From some of the other panelists, states have legal duties under human rights law to protect civil and political rights, such as the rights to expression, assembly, and peaceful protest. Those obligations predate the UN agreements, and they continue to apply with full force. And those duties give rise to an obligation to prevent and remedy corporate capture of democratic spaces, of decision-making spaces, including environmental policy-making spaces like this one, and at the domestic level. That applies from the local community meetings to the COP here in Dubai. And governments must adequately regulate corporations and regulate democratic spaces to promote a flourishing dialogue. That is, to control against a corporate capture, to safeguard public space, participation, and expression, to prevent the kind of undue influence that money all too often buys and crowding out of public access. It also means ensuring those obligations are to ensure that those who seek to exercise their rights can do so freely without fear of retaliation or repercussions, whether those are immediate or after the spotlight has been turned off. Earlier this year, states at the annual meeting of the parties to the Aarhus Convention, about which Michelle spoke earlier, acknowledged the need to curb corporate capture in international decision-making spaces, to guarantee meaningful environmental democracy, including committing to increasing their efforts on this, and they named specifically the COP and the Global Plastics Treaty, where negotiations are ongoing. But beyond those agreements, the duty to protect civil and political rights from restrictions by governments and encroachment by corporate actors exists for states outside of Aarhus and Escazú, for all states as pursuant to their human rights obligations. I want to just mention the call for a conflict of interest policy here at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which does not yet exist, is really a demand for enforcement and respect of these existing human rights obligations and respect for those human rights. It's not a push for new requirements, but rather to fill a long-standing historical gap and to demand enforcement of existing human rights obligations to protect and preserve environmental democracy. Transparency alone, we've seen some steps in that direction, may make it easier to expose the capture, which is apparent all around us, but it won't stop it. We need restrictions and protections on the public exercise of rights and freedoms to guarantee that voices can come into these critical spaces and follow up back home. Because without it, corporate capture and outsized influence is crowding out civic space. And Michelle mentioned the proliferation of SLAPP suits, which is another way that corporations are capturing democratic institutions, including abusing judicial systems to silence and chill critiques and retaliate against the kind of climate litigation you're talking about that is so imperative to ensuring climate justice. That's something that some states are taking action on in terms of developing anti-SLAPP directives, but we need to ensure that those and others are strong, implemented, and enforced at the national level and internationally, because without accountability, there can be no justice for people or the planet.
Thank you very much. And as a follow-up, I wanted to understand, what are the consequences for the enjoyment of human rights of corporate capture in international and national policy spaces addressing fossil fuel-related harms like the UN climate negotiations?
Well, I think the consequence of corporate capture is really visible all around us. This year, perhaps more than ever in this 30-year process. The consequence is derailment of progress with a focus on dangerous distractions rather than the solutions that we need. In this COP, as with the Global Plastics Treaty, we see fossil fuel companies doing everything to prop up their industry and prolong dependence on fossil fuels with its attendant harms for human rights. And at this COP, the numbers came out just days ago. There are record numbers of fossil fuel lobbyists in these halls. I think the figure was something like 1 in every 30 participants, 2,456. more than most delegations, I think with the exception of a couple, Brazil maybe and the UAE. But among those are more than 475 corporate capture lobbyists, carbon capture lobbyists there. Maybe corporate capture lobbyists too, but carbon capture lobbyists here at COP. And one of the ideas that they're trying to sell is this illusion that we can manage carbon or abate fossil fuels rather, fix them rather than ditch them. But that is a distraction from the central message that the science requires and justice demands to focus on phasing out. And the number of fossil fuel lobbyists that we're seeing here is really a wake-up call about the fact that the industry can operate with impunity. And so often, rather than reining in that influence, states have taken them into their own delegations and have enabled that access. But I want to bring us back to where we started, because the state duties are not limited to actions taken inside these walls and the consequences of the failure to abide by those duties. The respect for and protection of human rights outside of these walls has effects on what is or isn't delivered here and beyond. The fact that despite the calls from hundreds of organizations and urging of UN officials for their release, prominent political detainees such as Ahmed Mansour, and others remain behind bars. And that is not only a violation of their rights, but it infringes on environmental democracy here. And how? Because instead of liberating Ahmed Mansour as a demonstration of the professed inclusiveness of this process, he remains behind bars, and we see that having a chilling effect. In the meantime, expanding the number of people here at the COP just inures to the benefit of those with money and access, boosting the ranks of the fossil fuel industry in this space, while keeping down the numbers of those who could be expressing opposing views, could be voicing what the front lines and the fence line communities affected by the climate crisis and its drivers need to be said. So as a result of this outsized presence here at COP, but also in this process since its inception, we are still spending far more time debating dangerous distractions that have been proven ineffective, unfeasible, impractical, or too damaging than actually negotiating a full, fast, fair, and funded fossil fuel phase-out or the loss and damage financing that is urgently needed at scale. And the consequence of that, to your question, is that the rights of millions continue to be infringed due to a combination of climate harms and the conduct that is driving the fossil-based economy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Before we close, I wanted to check if we have Lilium Chagas, who is the Director for Climate and Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Brazil, in the room with us, because we have a few questions for you. If you are, can you raise your hand? Calling Lilium Chagas. Not there. Not there. Okay. Okay. Unfortunately, it seems like they're not here, and that's okay. So before we close, we do have 20 minutes for Q&As, and there will be some concluding remarks. I just want to check if there are any questions to start us off with. Yes. Is there a microphone to the person in purple?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Neumann. I'm a member of the European Parliament and Vice Chair of the Human Rights Committee there. So that's a bit the background of my question. First of all, I would like to thank Chai for her statement, because until then I was missing the issue that so many people who stand up and speak up for the environment are challenged. We have more than 200 people executed last year. And the challenge doesn't only come from governments, but also from companies or people in the communities who hope to get an easy and often short-lived benefit from whatever projects there are. So thank you so much for bringing this to the discussion and the table. And I think we all have to make up our minds how we can protect people like you better as our closest allies when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. I have one question to all speakers, because I'm still trying to make sense of this access of civil society and civic space here in UAE in particular, because you all said it has been an issue in all past COPs. I understand it was especially difficult in Egypt. So I'm trying to figure out how is it in comparison here to previous COPs, because UAE says it's quite open. We all know it has always been an issue, so I'm just trying to figure that out. So if you could be of any help with that one.
Do you want to take it, Michelle?
Maybe I could start and then give the floor to others. The main difference is that in Egypt, also inside, while here nothing happens in the city, no demonstration at all, and inside the COP premises, that's very complicated to organize something. We need to get the also from the and for those who are trying to push for at least naming some names, like we named Ahmed Mansour today, that's very complicated and sometimes difficult and put people also in danger.
I can maybe just briefly add, I think, as you know, Egypt was mentioned as also a COP27 that civil society and indigenous peoples in terms of participation generally during COP27. I think one thing to highlight is that we did have a chance to hear directly during COP27 from Egyptian activists. Some of them took the courage. It wasn't without severe personal risks, but they took the courage. They actually attended COP and they spoke. And we also had, of course, the sister of Allah speaking at several events. And so there was a presence of people daring to speak up. And that is a difference that we have, because this is not possible at this COP. I do want to mention that, because this was, I think, part of the question maybe, you know, what is the issue around public participation more broadly at the UNFCCC, and what have some of the challenges been? And it is true that this is not a new concern in terms of, you know, respect for civil and political rights in the host country. That's been coming up before, and then also some very specific concerns as they relate to, for example, I'm mentioning a few just here, and I welcome if others have other examples, but just to say, for example, in Glasgow, access to the actual negotiations for civil society was extremely limited. This was post-COVID, and there were restrictions in place that meant effectively civil society was not able to participate in many of the negotiations and even be in the room. So there was a very severe restriction de facto in terms of access. I also want to mention that during other climate negotiations, accessing negotiations is a big challenge for many activists from the global south who travel on passports, that don't allow them to easily enter certain countries. So that's a huge concern. And then also mentioning one more example, the COP that was held in Katowice. There were severe concerns and documented cases also of people being denied entry and some people being searched in their hotel rooms during COP, activists being searched. So very, you know, like actions against individuals, but actions that had a chilling effect and all those participating. I think that's really important, and that's something that I also want to underline that Nikki explained, that this is about, of course, the rights of people who cannot be here because they're behind bars or because they are fearful of what their participation could mean, and some people are not even attending for that reason. But it's also about the reality that a lot of activists who are here are self-censoring. And this is a very, very real phenomenon that we're seeing across the movement, and it's something that we've been discussing in preparation for this panel. And there is a real question, including for you know, people who speak up as to what this means for their future ability to do work on these really important issues.
Okay, we will do 2 more questions before we have to close. So why don't you go?
Thank you so much. My name is Emily. I'm a law student studying at the University of Hawaii, so we will be very affected by these issues. In terms of host country selection, what criteria would you propose? It's not a very transparent process, and I'm also wondering what the intervention point is. And this is not my opinion, but I've heard some feedback about this issue. What would you say to someone who says that requiring maybe like optional, the the ratification of optional protocol to the ICCPR or the Aarhus Convention is a Western idea, and that this is a Western campaign, and maybe implementing this change would favor Western countries.
Peraí, que eu não entendi direito. Alguém traduz para mim? Gabriel? Peraí, vem aqui mais perto.
Mais perto.
Eu sou surda. Sorry, she will translate to me because I'm learning.
Na segunda pergunta, ela perguntou... A primeira pergunta é, uma das palestrantes fez sugestões específicas sobre critérios para um país ser, eventualmente, para um país ser host da COP. Então, qual que são as sugestões da mesa? Porque uma das palestrantes falou especificamente sobre, enfim, critérios de direitos humanos e de respeito aos direitos humanos no geral. E o segundo, sobre como lidar com o tema dos protocolos que são não obrigatórios. Could you repeat the final sentence of your first question, please? The final sentence of your second question.
It would favor Western countries.
Se tem uma ocidentalização nesse debate sobre aderir aos protocolos aos protocolos não obrigatórios ou não, como se fosse uma campanha do Ocidente, enfim, como lidar com isso?
Que pergunta facinho. Tá. Difícil essa pergunta.
Well, we can
Fazer a outra pergunta.
Why don't you start and then we hand it back to you after.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Well, I think that clearly among the criteria for host country selection should be policy, a willingness to abide by that, to name it, and to abide, ensured that they do as well. But I welcome my co-panelists to add.
Can I just add one point?
Yeah.
For me, at least, and for some of my colleagues, special rapporteurs, that's also very important to make sure that the agreement currently the agreement is to make it public, and so far with no response coming from the UN or from the host country. And for the next COPs, that would be a minimum requirement that to disclose the information.
Yes, you can give. Let's try to wrap it up in the next 2 minutes.
Okay, I will be very brief. My name is Gordon Rattray. I work for the European Disability Forum. I first want to very briefly say thank you to the panelists for your very powerful testimonies. I want to remind the room that persons with disabilities are 16% of the global population. We are not yet a part of this conversation. We are excluded at so many different levels. To give you an example, thanks. To give you an example, if anyone was deaf in this room, they would not have been able to know what was going on. I do not criticize the organizers for this. I know that it's from a higher level. It's the same right throughout COP. Physical accessibility is poor. Information accessibility is poor. It's the same for the across the board. What I would like to say is, please, if you get a chance, take note of the statement that we make at the end of COP regarding disability inclusion from the people with disabilities here. The disability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running short on for reaching out, and we simply cannot talk about human rights without talking about Palestine. It's really important to remember those who are currently in Israeli military has taken. There are 12,000 Palestinian children held hostage since 2000. There are tens of thousands of people who have died in Palestine under the Israeli defense And it's really, really important to make sure that we hold them and we ensure that we talk about Palestinian children, but also Palestinian women, men, non-binary people, everyone who is a Palestinian. Because we cannot talk about human rights when there is a genocide going on. Also, opposite this room is the State of Palestine's pavilion. Please do go check it out. And also to talk about some other human rights and environmental defenders across the world. And from my country, there are a lot of amazing human rights defenders who are still imprisoned. Energies. It's really important to remember their names. It's really important to fight activists, a very colorful individual and a dear friend of the climate movement and a forever ally who has our unwavering support. Many of the achievements we have made as a movement and in negotiation spaces like at COP are thanks to the tireless work of people like Hong and others mentioned today. Her place and the place of all activists and human rights defenders and environmental defenders are not behind bars. It is as global citizens participating in a better world which they have helped build alongside their comrades, where they will always have a seat at the table. We have to ensure that we continue to fight for their release so that they can be free. Free them all.